Hi everyone, we're going to be starting off our first unit on American literary periods. We're going to be reading 4 or 5 different short stories during this unit. So I'm going to get you a little bit familiar with the categories that we put these short stories in. So while you are going through this video and this PowerPoint, you are going to fill out Cornell notes here. You're going to fill out the essential question, and then while I'm talking, you're going to do the notes kind of right here with the big part of the Cornell notes. And then when you're done, you're going to do the summary and the questions. I will upload this as a separate document so you kind of get the little instructions that I have on how you can get the maximum amount of points for your Cornell notes. And Cornell notes are due at the end of the unit, right before your test, or whatever major assessment is given at the end. So you're going to start off with writing the essential question: what American values, beliefs, or ideals are apparent based on classic texts of the literary periods? What that means is that it's really asking you, what are some things that Americans care about? And how can we tell based on those themes of the stories that they really like to read? So we are going to go through this kind of timeline here, starting with what came before, what we kind of consider to be the main American literary periods, and then all the way to present day. All right, so first of all, it's kind of important to talk about literary periods because as humans, we kind of like to categorize things. And in this case, we are categorizing not in terms of genre per se, but in terms of theme. Because a lot of the literature that we like to read, or the things that authors write about, tends to be influenced by major historical moments that happen around them as they're writing. So you'll see a lot of those major historical events are what inspire some of the authors to write down a certain type of way, using a specific type of technique that is new for that time period, or the themes that are new for that time period. So that's why we call them literary periods, kind of like a historical era, but instead of a historical era, it's kind of shaped by those themes that are common. But as we know, history and literature are always interconnected. It's really hard to talk about them separately. The humanities are always kind of like interlocked. So what came before the discovery of the Americas by Western Europe? First of all, we need to see the influences from the literature that already existed. In the Americas itself, that was Native American literature. That type of literature was an oral tradition. By that, I mean it is passed down from generation to generation, and it's verbal. All right, so it's kind of a big performance with a lot of repetition, a lot of call and response, and the themes and the purposes of this oral tradition is to preserve history, to explain the world around them, to explain and celebrate nature, and also pass along individual virtues. So having some sort of moral or lesson. All right, so they tend to be very simple stories. And then the theme would be very clear because kind of the lesson is spelled out for you. And also what influenced American literature would be British literature, of course, the English literature that came before American literature. So we're talking about stuff from Beowulf all the way to Shakespeare's time. It's really the foundation of the beginning of the American literary tradition. So a lot of American authors also read a lot of British literature and whatever influenced British literature also influences American literature. All right, so talk about the first kind of major historical moment. That would be, of course, the discovery of a new continent. And I know that there have been like various examples of this continent being discovered, not just by Christopher Columbus, but we're talking about how it really became a discovery of a new world in the sense that it is now profitable to colonize there. All right. And because people are making settlements in America, they bring everything with them. And but with that, that means not just bringing material things, but bringing their knowledge as well, and what they usually read, what they usually write about, the technologies that they already have that deals with reading and writing. All right, so during this period, first of all, you have a bunch of explorers and adventurers who are really interested in writing down what they are observing when they are in this new place. All right, so you got adventure reports or first-person narrative accounts from people like Christopher Columbus, from John Smith, and we also have De Vaca and Samuel de Champlain. So these are writers who kind of wrote down their interactions with Native Americans and also with their expeditions at sea, things like that. And then as the Puritans, what we think of as pilgrims, as the pilgrims settled as well, we also start getting a lot of those religious theories, religious discussions, disputes, and philosophies, and even sermons that were written down by the Puritans. The Puritans were a very simple people, hardworking people, and of course the things that they wrote about were plain and simple as well. They wrote some of the first type of educational textbook, you might say, and they tend to not be very frivolous in their writing because they just like to keep a simple way of life. However, as the colonists got restless, we've got another major history moment, and that would be, of course, the American Revolution. The American Revolution came about, as you know, when the colonists felt like their English king was a little bit too far away. They were ruled in a monarchy, but from across the ocean. And that led them to want to get away from what they thought were the more tyrannical taxing and other unfair and unjust ways in which the king dealt with them. So they got mad, they had a tea party, and the stuff that they wrote about during the American Revolution were not fun stories. There wasn't time to write fun stories or read fun stories. In fact, they had a very specific thing they needed to do, which was to rouse other colonists to want to fight this tyrannical king. All right, so they wrote pamphlets, they wrote angry letters, they wrote why it was important to declare independence. They also basically wrote a lot of poetry that was very political. So it was basically a lot of persuasive texts, a lot of rhetoric to convince people to fight. Or, if you're on the other side, to not fight. Another major history moment that happened during this time was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment, or what we call the Age of Reason, was really a time for the scientific method. A lot of scientists really did a lot of the inventions at this time. All right. And there were a lot of changing ideas because of this new world that they found as well. And because of all of these major changes in terms of how people thought in the scientific method, it spurred on the French and American revolutions. So the ideas that were prominent because of the Enlightenment was that people should be equal. People should have equal rights, individual rights. Individual thoughts were just as important as groupthink. The scientific method, of course, and also your own personal emotions are important and should be validated. It was important enough to feel that passion, to die for that passion, because you need that freedom. All right. And then that, of course, spurred on this idea of the sublime. So the sublime is all about nature and the individual and finding yourself from observing the nature around you and finding yourself by listening to your inner voice. All right, so that's the Romantic period. We're not talking about, fun love stories. We're not talking about Twilight or anything like that. The Romantic period was very nature-based and intuition-based, emotions, and the individual. It was inspired by those ideas of equality, of liberty, and of the scientific method and the individual. After the War of 1812, the United States looked around and they were like, oh, we've got a nation going. We've got a constitution. We're united in some sort of way through these states, and having a federal government. But really, what is the American identity? And people were really searching for that American identity. The characteristics of the Romantic period was individualism, so the self, and putting a lot of major importance on what the individual thinks, on self-reliance, on not conforming to what everyone else thinks, not going with what everyone else thinks, and to basically dig into the human mind and those emotions that guide us with our intuition. So fear being one of them. Love can be one of those emotions as well. And then, of course, nature and appreciation of the natural world was another major characteristic of the Romantic period. Some important authors during this time were Ralph Waldo Emerson. He wrote a bunch of essays on why it was important to rely on yourself and not on others, and to be an individual and to let your own emotions guide the way you think. Another author was Henry David Thoreau, who was very, of course, influenced by Ralph Waldo Emerson, who kind of gave him a little bit of his land to stay on. And Thoreau took the time, 3 years, to sit on that land and build a little cabin for himself, farm for himself, and basically cut himself off from the rest of the world in this little cabin in the woods. And then he wrote it all down in a book called Walden. Another author during this time was Herman Melville, who wrote Moby Dick, and that was all about the search of something that may or may not be real, but really pursuing something, having that passion. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was the author of The Scarlet Letter, very almost Puritan influenced type of writing, because he was a very religious guy. And that book was really all about sinning and adultery. Again, very emotional stuff. Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson were two poets during this time, and they wrote about the American identity. Sometimes they wrote about death. So again, these are very major themes of the Romantic period. All right, I will be stopping this video over here and starting a new video for the rest of this PowerPoint.